The first wave of U.S. Marines approached the shoreline under conditions that had already deviated from expectation. Pre-invasion naval bombardment had been intense but brief, based on assumptions that Japanese defenses on Peleliu were limited and exposed. From the decks of landing craft, the island appeared quiet, its coral ridges low against the horizon, its beaches narrow and pale. There was no visible movement, no immediate return fire. That silence did not hold. As amphibious tractors crossed the reef and entered the final stretch toward the beach, concealed Japanese artillery opened with precision. Unlike previous island engagements, defensive positions had not been concentrated along the waterline. Instead, guns were embedded within the limestone ridges inland, masked by terrain and engineered openings. Fire came from oblique angles, striking landing vehicles in enfilade. Several LVTs were hit before reaching shore, their cargo, men, ammunition, radios, lost in shallow water. Units from the 1st Marine Division began disembarking under direct observation from elevated positions they could not yet identify. The heat was immediate and oppressive, intensified by the white coral reflecting sunlight upward. Temperatures exceeded operational norms, and the Marines were carrying full combat loads, including extra ammunition in anticipation of resistance that now proved far more organized than briefings had indicated. The beach itself offered minimal cover. Sand transitioned quickly into jagged coral, making rapid movement difficult and increasing exposure time under fire. Engineers tasked with clearing obstacles found themselves targeted as soon as they began work. Demolition charges intended for beach defenses were instead used to neutralize unexpected firing points near the landing zones. Communication between units degraded quickly. Radios malfunctioned under heat and salt exposure, and visual signaling was limited by terrain fragmentation. Platoons became separated within minutes of landing, each forced to adapt independently. The original plan, swift movement inland to secure the airfield, was already compromised before the first hour had passed. Japanese defensive doctrine on Peleliu had shifted from beach resistance to attritional warfare inland. The absence of resistance at the shoreline was deliberate. Marines advancing beyond the beach were entering a pre-constructed kill zone, defined not by visible fortifications, but by overlapping fields of fire originating from concealed positions in the ridges ahead. Artillery support from offshore continued but proved less effective than anticipated. Without clear target identification, naval gunfire was often directed at general terrain features rather than confirmed enemy emplacements. The limestone absorbed impact, and many positions remained intact. Air support faced similar limitations. Smoke and dust obscured already hidden targets. Despite mounting confusion, small unit leadership became the decisive factor. Squad and platoon leaders began organizing ad hoc advances, identifying partial cover in shell holes and coral outcroppings. Movement shifted from coordinated waves to fragmented pushes, each measured in meters rather than objectives. By the end of the initial landing phase, the Marines had established a tenuous foothold, but at a cost that indicated the campaign would not follow projected timelines. The terrain had already asserted itself as a primary adversary, and the Japanese defense, largely unseen, had begun to dictate the tempo of the battle. The operational objective for the assault force remained the same: secure the island's airfield and deny its use to Japanese forces. Positioned near the southern portion of Peleliu, the airstrip appeared, on maps and reconnaissance imagery, as an exposed and vulnerable target. In practice, it became one of the most dangerous areas on the island. Units pushing inland from the beaches encountered increasingly organized resistance as they approached the open ground surrounding the airfield. Unlike the broken coral terrain behind them, the airstrip and its perimeter offered little natural cover. The Japanese had anticipated this and calibrated their defensive layout accordingly. Firing positions were established along the edges of surrounding ridges, with pre-registered artillery and mortar zones covering the entire approach. As elements of the 1st Marine Regiment advanced, they were forced into direct exposure. Movement across the airfield's approaches triggered coordinated fire from multiple directions. Machine guns, mortars, and artillery created overlapping zones that could not be bypassed. The flat terrain eliminated concealment, forcing Marines to rely on speed, suppressive fire, and limited smoke cover. Attempts to coordinate larger movements quickly broke down. Units advancing on slightly different vectors found themselves isolated as communication lagged. Radio interference and equipment failures persisted, and runners became the primary means of relaying orders, often at significant personal risk. Commanders at the company level had to adjust in real time, redirecting platoons to exploit minor terrain features such as shallow depressions or abandoned Japanese trenches near the airstrip's edge. Supporting fires were intensified. Naval gunfire shifted closer to friendly positions, increasing the risk of miscalculation but also providing necessary suppression against ridge-based defenses. Carrier-based aircraft conducted repeated strafing runs, focusing on suspected firing points along the higher ground. However, the effectiveness remained inconsistent. Japanese positions were often recessed, with narrow firing apertures that minimized exposure even under sustained bombardment. Engineers played a critical role during this phase. As forward elements reached the fringes of the airfield, demolition teams were deployed to neutralize hardened positions that had survived bombardment. Flamethrowers and satchel charges became essential tools, particularly against bunkers constructed with reinforced coral and earth. These engagements were conducted at extremely close range, often requiring multiple attempts to fully disable a single position. Logistical strain increased as the advance continued. The open terrain made resupply difficult during daylight hours. Ammunition had to be carried forward manually under fire, while wounded personnel accumulated in exposed positions awaiting evacuation. Corpsmen operated under constant threat, moving between scattered units with limited medical supplies. Evacuation routes back to the beach were neither secure nor clearly defined, further complicating casualty management. Despite these conditions, portions of the airfield were gradually brought under U.S. control. Progress was measured in sections rather than a complete seizure. Individual units secured fragments of runway and adjacent structures, establishing temporary positions while awaiting reinforcement. The Japanese, however, did not attempt to retake the airfield in large-scale counterattacks. Instead, they maintained pressure through sustained, localized fire from surrounding high ground. By the end of this phase, the airfield was partially operational in a limited sense, but far from secure. The surrounding ridges remained in Japanese hands, allowing continued observation and indirect fire onto the captured terrain. What had been considered a key objective was now an exposed position requiring constant defense, its value tied directly to the unresolved battle unfolding in the heights beyond. North of the airfield, the terrain shifted abruptly into a complex of limestone ridges that would define the remainder of the campaign. What appeared on maps as a series of irregular elevations proved, on contact, to be a deeply integrated defensive network. The feature later referred to by U.S. forces as the Omerbrogel Ridges was not a single objective, but a layered system of interlocking positions extending across broken ground, narrow draws, and steep coral outcrops. As elements of the 1st Marine Division began probing this area, the nature of Japanese defensive planning became fully apparent. Rather than relying on forward trenches or easily identifiable bunkers, the defenders had constructed a network of caves, tunnels, and concealed firing points embedded directly into the rock. Many of these positions were mutually supporting, with fields of fire covering adjacent slopes and approaches. Movement into the ridges triggered engagement from multiple elevations simultaneously. Initial advances were conducted by small units attempting to identify paths through the terrain. There were no clear routes. The coral underfoot fractured easily, creating unstable footing that slowed progress and increased fatigue. Vegetation offered intermittent concealment but also limited visibility, allowing Japanese positions to remain undetected until they opened fire at close range. Snipers and light machine guns were positioned to target movement along the most accessible approaches. Mortar fire, directed from concealed observation points, adjusted quickly to concentrations of Marines attempting to maneuver. Attempts to flank individual positions often led into additional kill zones as the terrain forced units into predictable channels between ridges. The absence of visible targets complicated the use of supporting fires. Artillery and naval gunfire could be directed onto ridge lines, but the majority of Japanese positions were recessed within the rock, protected from fragmentation and blast effects. Air support faced similar limitations. Pilots reported difficulty identifying targets, and strikes were often based on approximate coordinates provided by forward observers under fire. Command decisions at this stage reflected a shift in understanding. The expectation of rapid movement through the ridges was abandoned. Instead, the advance became deliberate and methodical, with emphasis placed on isolating and reducing individual positions. This required close coordination between infantry, engineers, and supporting weapons. Flamethrower teams and demolition units were brought forward in greater numbers. Engagements took place at extremely short distances, often within meters of cave openings or concealed apertures. A single position could require multiple assaults to neutralize, as interconnected tunnels allowed defenders to withdraw and reoccupy firing points after initial suppression. Logistics became increasingly strained. Supplying units within the ridges required movement across exposed ground or through narrow contested routes. Water consumption rose sharply due to heat and exertion, while resupply efforts were slowed by terrain and ongoing fire. Casualty evacuation was particularly difficult. Stretcher teams had to navigate steep inclines and unstable surfaces under intermittent engagement. Intelligence on the full extent of the Japanese defensive network remained incomplete. Captured documents and prisoner interrogations provided limited insight, but the scale of preparation suggested months of construction prior to the invasion. The ridges were not a secondary defensive line, they were the primary battlefield. By the time U.S. forces had established initial footholds within the ridge system, it was clear that control of the airfield alone would not determine the outcome of the operation. The enemy retained both observation and firing dominance from the heights. The campaign had entered a phase where terrain, more than maneuver, dictated every engagement. As operations pushed deeper into the ridge system, unit cohesion continued to degrade under the combined effects of terrain, heat, and persistent enemy fire. The battlefield no longer supported coordinated regimental movements. Instead, it fractured into a series of localized engagements, each defined by immediate terrain features and the proximity of concealed Japanese positions. Companies advancing along adjacent ridge lines often lost contact within hours. Narrow draws and abrupt elevation changes blocked line of sight, while radio communication remained unreliable. In many cases, platoons operated without direct guidance from higher command, relying on pre-established objectives that quickly became irrelevant as resistance shifted. Commanders at the battalion level struggled to maintain an accurate picture of unit locations. The Japanese defensive network continued to exploit these conditions. Rather than engaging in large-scale counterattacks, defenders applied sustained pressure through small coordinated actions. Fire would emerge from one slope, drawing attention and suppressive fire, while secondary positions engaged from a different angle. This pattern forced Marines to divide their focus, often exposing themselves when attempting to respond. Efforts to secure ridgeline positions required vertical movement under fire. Ascents were slow and physically demanding, with Marines climbing over sharp coral surfaces that provided little cover. At the crest, positions were rarely secured in a single action. Cave entrances and firing apertures were positioned just below ridge lines, allowing defenders to remain concealed until the final moments of an assault. Engineers and assault teams became central to every advance. Standard infantry tactics proved insufficient against fortified rock positions. Flamethrowers were used to force defenders deeper into cave systems, followed by demolition charges placed at entrances or ventilation points. However, the interconnected nature of the tunnels often allowed defenders to survive initial assaults and reappear at alternate openings. Artillery coordination improved incrementally but remained constrained by target visibility. Forward observers embedded with frontline units adjusted fire based on sound, muzzle flash, or limited visual cues. In some instances, artillery was used to seal cave entrances through repeated impacts, though this required sustained fire and precise adjustment. Logistical support continued to lag behind operational needs. Ammunition expenditure increased significantly due to the nature of close-range engagements and repeated assaults on the same positions. Water shortages became critical in certain sectors, with resupply routes exposed to observation from higher ground. Units were forced to ration under extreme heat, affecting both physical endurance and decision-making. Medical evacuation presented ongoing challenges. Casualties often remained in forward positions for extended periods due to the difficulty of extraction. Corpsmen operated within small perimeters, establishing temporary aid stations behind partial cover. Movement of the wounded required coordination between units that were not always in communication, delaying evacuation timelines. Despite these constraints, incremental gains were made. Individual ridgelines and pockets of resistance were cleared, though often at high cost and without immediate strategic advantage. Each secured position exposed another, deeper layer of the defensive network. The Japanese did not contest every meter of ground equally, instead allowing certain advances while maintaining control over key terrain features that influenced movement and observation. By the conclusion of this phase, the operational environment had fully transitioned into a sustained attritional fight. The front line was no longer linear but dispersed across multiple elevations and directions. Control was measured not by territory in the conventional sense, but by the temporary suppression of specific positions within a terrain that continued to favor the defender. As the advance into the ridges continued, U.S. commanders increased reliance on concentrated firepower to offset the advantages of terrain and concealment. The objective was no longer rapid movement, but systematic reduction of fortified positions through coordinated use of artillery, naval gunfire, and specialized assault teams. Naval assets offshore adjusted their role accordingly. Battleships and cruisers began delivering sustained, targeted fire missions against identified ridge sectors rather than broad pre-assault bombardments. Spotters ashore worked to refine targeting, though visibility remained a persistent limitation. The limestone terrain absorbed much of the explosive force, and even direct hits did not guarantee the destruction of deeply embedded cave systems. Artillery units established more forward positions to reduce response time and improve accuracy. Guns were repositioned as terrain allowed, often at risk of counter-battery fire or observation from elevated Japanese positions. Fire missions became more frequent and more precise, focusing on suppressing specific firing points during infantry assaults rather than attempting to neutralize entire ridge complexes at once. Air support was integrated into this pattern where possible. Carrier-based aircraft conducted repeated strikes on ridge lines, using rockets and strafing runs to target suspected cave entrances and movement corridors. However, the effectiveness of these attacks remained inconsistent. Without clear visual confirmation, pilots often relied on guidance from ground units that themselves had limited visibility. At the infantry level, the role of assault teams became increasingly specialized. Flamethrowers, demolition charges, and heavy weapons were deployed in coordinated sequences. A typical engagement involved suppressive fire from rifles and machine guns, followed by flamethrower bursts directed into cave openings, and finally demolition charges to seal or collapse entrances. Each step required precise timing and exposed the assault teams to close-range fire. The physical structure of the caves continued to complicate these efforts. Many positions were constructed with multiple entrances, internal chambers, and connecting tunnels. Neutralizing one opening did not ensure the position was cleared. In some cases, defenders reoccupied previously attacked positions hours later, using alternate access points that had not been identified during the initial assault. Japanese forces adapted to the increased use of firepower by minimizing exposure. Firing patterns became shorter and more controlled, reducing the likelihood of detection. Observation posts relayed information on U.S. movements, allowing defenders to concentrate fire at critical moments rather than maintaining constant engagement. Logistical coordination was adjusted to support this methodical approach. Ammunition resupply was prioritized for units engaged in repeated assaults, with particular emphasis on flamethrower fuel and demolition materials. Supply routes remained vulnerable, but efforts were made to establish more consistent movement corridors through partially secured terrain. Medical support also adapted. Aid stations were positioned closer to the front lines where possible, reducing the time required to treat and evacuate casualties. However, the proximity to ongoing combat increased the risk to medical personnel, and facilities were often relocated as the line shifted. Progress during this phase was measurable but limited. Individual positions were destroyed or rendered unusable, reducing the density of Japanese fire in certain sectors. However, the overall defensive network remained intact. Each cleared position revealed additional layers behind it, often requiring the same level of effort to address. The increasing reliance on firepower did not simplify the battle. Instead, it redefined it as a process of continuous engagement against a defense designed to absorb and outlast conventional assault methods. The terrain and construction of the Japanese positions ensured that even concentrated force produced incremental results, extending the duration and cost of the operation. As daylight operations settled into a pattern of deliberate assaults and incremental gains, the character of the fighting shifted after dark. The Japanese defense, designed to avoid large-scale exposure, relied increasingly on nighttime activity to maintain pressure and disrupt U.S. positions within the ridges. American units, often holding recently secured ground, faced a different set of conditions once visibility dropped. The terrain that had complicated daytime advances now limited defensive awareness. Narrow ridgelines, broken coral surfaces, and dense shadows created multiple avenues for infiltration. Japanese forces used their familiarity with the terrain and tunnel networks to move between positions with reduced risk of detection. Infiltration tactics were controlled and deliberate. Rather than massed attacks, small groups advanced toward U.S. lines, probing for gaps or isolated positions. Movement was often silent, with limited use of equipment that could reveal location. Engagements occurred at close range, frequently without warning, forcing Marines to respond under uncertain conditions. Perimeter defense became a priority. Units established overlapping fields of fire using machine guns and rifles, oriented toward likely approaches based on daytime observation. Trip flares and improvised warning devices were deployed where terrain allowed, though their effectiveness was inconsistent due to irregular ground and vegetation. Commanders emphasized fire discipline. Indiscriminate firing risked revealing positions without clear targets, while controlled response increased the chance of identifying infiltration routes. Listening posts were established forward of main positions to provide early warning, but maintaining these posts exposed small teams to isolation and potential encirclement. Artillery support was adjusted for night operations. Pre-registered defensive fire zones were established during daylight hours, allowing rapid response to suspected infiltration. When triggered, these missions could disrupt movement through specific draws or approaches. However, the complexity of the terrain limited coverage, and not all routes could be effectively targeted. Illumination rounds were used intermittently to expose movement, but their use had trade-offs. While they provided temporary visibility, they also silhouetted U.S. positions, creating additional risk. Commanders had to balance the need for observation with the potential for increased vulnerability. Japanese forces exploited any lapse in coordination. In sectors where units had advanced unevenly or where communication remained degraded, infiltration groups were able to reach rear positions, targeting supply points or isolated elements. These actions did not aim to retake ground, but to impose continuous pressure and degrade operational stability. Logistics during night hours became more complex. Resupply efforts were often conducted under limited light to reduce exposure, but navigation through the ridges increased the risk of misdirection. Units occasionally received incorrect or delayed supplies, further complicating already strained conditions. Water distribution remained a critical concern, with consumption rates unaffected by the change in operational tempo. Medical evacuation was particularly difficult at night. Movement of wounded personnel required coordination across terrain that could not be fully observed. In some cases, evacuation was delayed until daylight, increasing the risk of complications for casualties. By the end of this phase, U.S. forces had adapted to the rhythm of continuous operations, daytime assaults followed by nighttime defense against infiltration. The absence of clear front lines and the persistent threat of close-range engagement required constant vigilance. Control of terrain during daylight did not ensure security after dark, reinforcing the need for sustained coordination across all levels of command. Sustained operations within the ridges began to impose cumulative strain on personnel and command structures. The initial assault units of the 1st Marine Division had been engaged continuously under conditions that exceeded planning assumptions. Heat, limited water supply, and the physical demands of terrain movement reduced operational effectiveness across all levels. By this stage, fatigue was no longer an individual factor but a unit-wide condition. Reaction times slowed, coordination suffered, and small errors in movement or communication carried greater consequences. Commanders observed a decline in the ability of front-line units to conduct repeated assaults on fortified positions without extended recovery periods, time that the operational tempo did not allow. Medical reports reflected the broader situation. In addition to combat casualties, increasing numbers of Marines were affected by heat exhaustion and dehydration. These cases required evacuation and treatment, further straining already limited medical resources. Corpsmen continued to operate under direct threat, managing both combat injuries and environmental stress within forward positions. At higher levels of command, the discrepancy between projected timelines and actual progress forced reassessment. The original expectation of a relatively rapid seizure of Peleliu had proven inaccurate. The ridge system remained largely under Japanese control, and each attempt to accelerate the advance resulted in disproportionate losses. Operational adjustments began to take shape. The approach shifted further toward containment and systematic reduction rather than continuous forward pressure. Units were directed to secure and hold specific sectors, isolating Japanese positions before attempting their destruction. This required improved coordination between adjacent elements, despite ongoing communication challenges. Reinforcement decisions reflected the need to sustain the operation without overextending existing units. Elements from other formations were considered to support or relieve frontline forces, allowing for partial rotation and recovery. These transitions had to be managed carefully, as incoming units required time to adapt to the terrain and the nature of the defensive network. Fire support planning became more deliberate. Rather than reacting to immediate contact, artillery and naval gunfire were scheduled in support of defined objectives, with pre-planned missions designed to suppress known positions during coordinated assaults. This reduced some of the unpredictability experienced in earlier phases but required accurate intelligence and timing. Japanese defensive activity showed no indication of collapse. Despite sustained bombardment and localized losses, their positions remained functional. The emphasis on concealment and internal mobility allowed them to preserve combat effectiveness even as individual positions were destroyed. Engagement patterns continued to favor short, controlled bursts of fire from protected locations. Logistical operations adapted to the revised approach. Supply routes were stabilized where possible, with efforts to establish more reliable movement corridors through partially secured terrain. Water distribution remained a priority, with additional measures taken to ensure consistent delivery despite ongoing exposure to enemy observation. The shift in command perspective did not immediately alter conditions on the ground, but it established a framework for continued operations. The battle had transitioned fully into a prolonged engagement defined by endurance, coordination, and the incremental reduction of a defense designed to resist rapid defeat. As the campaign extended beyond initial expectations, command decisions at the operational level led to the introduction of additional forces to sustain pressure within the ridge system. Elements of the U.S. Army's 81st Infantry Division, already present in the region for supporting operations, were assigned a more direct role in the Peleliu fight. This marked a transition not only in personnel but in the structure of the ongoing engagement. The relief of frontline Marine units was conducted in phases. Conditions on the ground complicated the process. There were no clearly defined front lines, and positions often consisted of isolated pockets spread across irregular terrain. Incoming Army units had to move into sectors where contact with the enemy was continuous and where the disposition of both friendly and opposing forces was not fully mapped. Coordination between outgoing and incoming units required detailed, localized briefings. Knowledge of specific cave systems, firing angles, and concealed approaches was critical. In many cases, this information could not be fully conveyed through formal channels alone. Direct handovers at the platoon and company level became necessary, with Marines guiding Army elements into position under active threat. The Army units encountered the same conditions that had defined earlier phases of the battle. The ridge system remained intact, and Japanese positions continued to operate with minimal exposure. The absence of visible targets persisted, reinforcing the need for methodical, small unit action supported by engineers and firepower. Differences in operational experience required rapid adaptation. While Army units had conducted amphibious and island operations elsewhere, the specific defensive structure on Peleliu presented unique challenges. Initial movements emphasized caution, with efforts focused on consolidating positions and understanding terrain before initiating aggressive action. Fire support integration continued under the new command structure. Artillery units maintained established firing plans, while naval gunfire and air support remained available as needed. Coordination improved incrementally as Army forward observers established communication with supporting assets, though the limitations imposed by terrain and target visibility remained unchanged. Logistical systems were adjusted to accommodate the transition. Supply routes previously established by Marine units were maintained and expanded where possible. Army logistics personnel worked to ensure continuity in the delivery of ammunition, water, and medical supplies. The existing constraints, exposure to observation, difficult terrain, and limited mobility continue to affect resupply operations. Japanese defensive activity remained consistent. There was no significant change in their tactical approach following the introduction of new U.S. forces. Engagements continued to be characterized by short-range fire from concealed positions, supported by coordinated use of terrain. The defensive network functioned independently of the specific identity of the attacking units. Medical evacuation procedures were carried forward with adjustments based on lessons learned during earlier phases. Aid stations were positioned to reduce evacuation time, though movement of casualties remained dependent on terrain and ongoing engagement. Coordination between units was essential to ensure that evacuation routes remained viable. The transition of control did not produce an immediate shift in momentum. Instead, it allowed for sustained operations without further degrading the effectiveness of the initial assault force. The battle continued under a revised structure, maintaining pressure on the ridge system while incorporating new units into an environment already defined by attrition and limited maneuverability. With the transition of front-line responsibility largely complete, operations entered a phase defined by structured, repetitive engagements aimed at eliminating remaining Japanese positions within the ridge system. The approach was no longer exploratory. Known sectors were assigned, mapped to the extent possible, and reduced through coordinated small unit action supported by concentrated firepower. Army units, building on information passed from Marine elements, focused on isolating specific sections of the ridges. Movement was controlled and deliberate. Rather than advancing across broad fronts, units targeted limited objectives, individual draws, slopes, or clusters of cave positions, securing each before proceeding. This reduced exposure to enfilade fire but extended the time required for measurable progress. Engineers remained central to every operation. Demolition charges were employed not only to destroy entrances but to collapse sections of the rock where feasible. Flamethrowers were used to force defenders deeper into enclosed spaces, disrupting their ability to maintain coordinated fire. In many cases, successive assaults were required as interconnected tunnels allowed Japanese forces to reposition internally and re-engage from alternate openings. Artillery support was refined to align with this methodical approach. Pre-planned fire missions were executed in direct support of specific objectives, with forward observers adjusting fire based on limited but improving target identification. Repeated shelling of known positions was used to degrade structural integrity over time, though complete neutralization remained difficult due to the depth and reinforcement of many cave systems. Naval gunfire continued to supplement these efforts, particularly against larger ridge features where sustained bombardment could be applied. Coordination between ground units and offshore assets improved incrementally, but the fundamental challenge persisted. The majority of enemy positions remained concealed until they engaged. Japanese defensive activity showed signs of reduced frequency in certain sectors, but not of disorganization. Fire discipline remained consistent, with engagements initiated at moments of maximum vulnerability for advancing units. There were no large-scale counterattacks. Instead, defenders maintained their established pattern of controlled, localized resistance. Logistical operations stabilized relative to earlier phases. Supply routes, though still exposed, became more predictable as secured corridors expanded. Ammunition distribution was managed to support repeated assaults, with particular emphasis on engineering materials. Water supply remained a constant priority, with additional effort directed toward maintaining consistent delivery under operational conditions. Medical support benefited from improved coordination. Evacuation routes were more clearly defined, and aid stations were positioned to support ongoing operations within assigned sectors. However, the terrain continued to slow movement, and evacuation timelines remained longer than in less restrictive environments. Progress during this phase was measurable in terms of reduced enemy fire from previously active positions. Sections of the ridge system were cleared and held, limiting the Japanese ability to influence adjacent areas. However, the depth of the defensive network meant that each cleared sector revealed additional positions beyond it. The operation had become a process of systematic reduction, requiring sustained coordination, repeated application of specialized assault techniques, and continuous logistical support. The terrain and defensive construction continued to impose limits on the pace of advance, ensuring that each gain was incremental and required deliberate effort to secure. The final phase of operations on Peleliu did not involve a decisive breakthrough, but a continuation of the same methodical process that had come to define the battle. Remaining Japanese positions within the ridge system were reduced through repeated localized engagements. By this stage, the frequency of enemy fire had decreased in several sectors, but resistance persisted in isolated pockets that retained the ability to inflict casualties. U.S. units, now operating with a clearer understanding of the terrain and defensive layout, focused on eliminating these remaining positions. Patrols were used to confirm areas of reduced activity, followed by targeted assaults where resistance was still encountered. Engineers continued to seal cave entrances and collapse accessible tunnel sections, often returning to previously engaged positions to ensure they had not been reoccupied. Commanders placed increased emphasis on verification rather than assumption. The absence of fire from a given position was not considered confirmation of neutralization. Units were directed to physically inspect and, where possible, destroy all accessible defensive structures within their assigned sectors. This extended the duration of operations but reduced the likelihood of residual resistance affecting secured areas. Japanese forces, though diminished, maintained their established defensive approach. Engagements remained controlled and limited in duration, with defenders utilizing remaining positions to delay clearance efforts. There was no coordinated attempt to retake lost ground. The defensive network, even in a degraded state, continued to function in a fragmented manner. Logistical support reached a level of relative stability compared to earlier phases. Established supply routes allowed for more consistent delivery of ammunition and water, supporting ongoing clearance operations. Medical evacuation improved as secured areas expanded, though the terrain still imposed limitations on speed and accessibility. The formal conclusion of organized resistance was not marked by a single event, but by a gradual reduction in enemy activity across the ridge system. Isolated engagements continued even after major objectives had been secured, requiring ongoing patrols and monitoring. The process of declaring the island secure involved systematic verification rather than a clear endpoint. From an operational perspective, the outcome of the battle raised questions about initial assumptions and planning. The expectation of rapid seizure had not accounted for the depth and design of the Japanese defensive system. The terrain, combined with the shift in enemy tactics toward attritional defense, extended the duration of the operation and increased its cost. The airfield, initially identified as the primary objective, had been secured relatively early, but its utility remained limited while the surrounding high ground was contested. Only after the reduction of the ridge system could it be used without continuous exposure to enemy fire. The battle demonstrated the effectiveness of defensive construction integrated with terrain, as well as the limitations of conventional bombardment against deeply embedded positions. It also reinforced the importance of coordination between infantry, engineers, and supporting fires in environments where maneuver was restricted. By the end of the operation, control of Peleliu had been established, but through a process that diverged significantly from initial expectations. The engagement was defined not by rapid movement or decisive action, but by sustained effort against a defense designed to absorb and prolong combat.